We met 10 years ago. We'd wander past where they let us go. Imagine how we'd use all our time. Keep dreaming, we would have tried to fly. And we'd share secrets all the time. Never lie, never fight. You'd be the princess, I'm your knight. Reunite every night. And we'd share secrets all the time. Never lie, never fight. You'd be the princess, I'm your knight. Reunite every night. We met 10 years ago. We'd wander past where they let us go. Imagine how we'd use all our time. Keep dreaming, we would have tried to fly. And we'd share secrets all the time. Never lie, never fight. You'd be the princess, I'm your knight. Reunite every night. Lucid dreaming, endless sunlight. Never grow up, no more goodbyes. Lucid dreaming, endless sunlight. Never grow up, no more goodbyes. We'd share secrets all the time. Never lie, never fight. You'd be the princess, I'm your knight. Reunite every night.
I just realized I was muted. Shit. Alright, we'll do that again. It's orthopraxy. We're still in chapter 1. We now come to an absolutely decisive fact. Propaganda is very frequently described as a manipulation for the purpose of changing ideas or opinions, of making individuals believe some idea or fact, and finally of making them adhere to some doctrine, all matters of mind. Or to put it differently, propaganda is described as dealing with beliefs or ideas. If the individual is a Marxist, it tries to destroy his conviction and turn him into an anti-Marxist, and so on. It calls on all the psychological mechanisms, but appeals to reason as well. It tries to convince, to bring about a decision, to create a firm adherence to some truth. Then, obviously, if the conviction is sufficiently strong, after some soul-searching, the individual is ready for action. This line of reasoning is completely wrong. To view propaganda as still being what it was in 1850 is to cling to an obsolete concept of man and of the means to influence him. It is to condemn oneself to understand nothing about modern propaganda. The aim of modern propaganda is no longer to modify ideas, but to provoke action. It is no longer to change adherence to a doctrine, but to make the individual cling irrationally to a process of action. It is no longer to lead to a choice, but to loosen the reflexes. It is no longer to transform an opinion, but to arouse an active and mythical belief. Let us note here, in passing, how badly equipped opinion surveys are to gauge propaganda. We will have to come back to this point in the study of propaganda effects. Simply to ask an individual if he believes this or that, or if he has this or that idea, gives absolutely no indication of what behavior he will adopt or what action he will take. Only action is of concern to modern propaganda, for its aim is to precipitate an individual's action with maximum effectiveness and economy. When one analyzes the great modern systems of propaganda, one always finds this primary aim of producing action, of mobilizing the individual. Occasionally it is expressly stated, as when Goebbels distinguished between Haltung, behavior, and Stimmung, morale. But the former is of greater importance. After a bloody raid, Goebbels could state, the morale is quite low, but that means little. The behavior holds well. The morale is volatile and varies readily. Therefore, above all, the right action must be obtained, the right behavior maintained. In the analysis of propaganda, specialists have especially noted this desire to obtain immediate action rather than a change of opinion. The same idea is held by Mao Tse-tung. Propaganda aims at mobilizing. Therefore, it is not necessary to change their opinions, but to make all individuals jointly attack a task. Even political education, so important with Mao, aims essentially at mobilization. And in the Soviet Union, political education has occasionally been criticized for taking some intellectual and purely domestic turn to secure action, and then failing in its aim. The task of agitation is not to educate, but to mobilize people. And there is always the matter of actual involvement in precise tasks defined by the party. For example, to obtain increased productivity. The propagandist, therefore, does not normally address himself to the individual's intelligence, for the process of intellectual persuasion is long and uncertain, and the road from such intellectual conviction to action even more so. The individual rarely acts purely on the basis of an idea. Moreover, to place propaganda efforts on the intellectual level would require that the propagandists engage in individual debate with each person, an unthinkable method. It is necessary to obtain at least a minimum of participation from everybody. This passive participation is what Goebbels meant when he said, "I conceive of a radio program that will make each listener participate in the events of the nation. But at the same time, the listener is forced into passivity by the dictator." It can be active or passive, but in any case, it is not simply a matter of public opinion. To see propaganda only as something related to public opinion implies a great intellectual independence on the part of the propagandee, who is, after all, only a third party in any political action, and who is asked only one opinion. This obviously coincides with a conception of liberal democracy, which assumes that the most one can do with the citizen is to change his opinion in such fashion as to win his vote at election time. The concept of a close relationship between public opinion and propaganda rests on the presumption of an independent popular will. If this concept were right, the role of propaganda would be to modify that popular will, which, of course, expresses itself in votes. But what this concept does not take into consideration is that the injection of propaganda into the mechanism of popular action actually suppresses liberal democracy, after which we are no longer dealing with votes or people's sovereignty. Propaganda therefore aims solely at participation. The participation may be active or passive. Active if propaganda has been able to mobilize the individual for action. Passive if the individual does not act directly but psychologically supports that action. But one may ask, does this not bring us right back to public opinion? Certainly not, for opinion leaves the individual a mere spectator who may eventually, but not necessarily, resort to action. Therefore, the idea of participation is much stronger. The supporter of a football team, though not physically in the game, makes his presence felt psychologically by rooting for the players, exciting them, and pushing them to outdo themselves. Similarly, the faithful who attend Mass do not interfere physically, but their communicant participation is positive and changes the nature of the phenomena. These two examples illustrate what we mean by passive participation obtained through propaganda. Such an action cannot be obtained by the process of choice and deliberation. To be effective, propaganda must constantly short-circuit all thought and decision. The application of motivational research studies to advertising also leads to this. It must operate on the individual at the level of the unconscious. He must not know that he is being shaped by outside forces. This is one of the conditions for the success of propaganda. But some central core in him must be reached in order to release the mechanism in the unconscious, which will provide the appropriate and expected action. We have just said that action exactly suited to its ends must be obtained. This leads us to state that if the classic but outmoded view of propaganda consists in defining it as an adherence of man to an orthodoxy, true modern propaganda seeks, on the contrary, to obtain an orthopraxy. What's an orthopraxy? Learning new words, 'cause I'm dumb. The study of religion. Orthopraxy is correct conduct by both ethical and liturgical as opposed to faith or grace. Orthopraxy is in contrast with orthodoxy, which emphasizes correct belief, and ritualism, the practice of rituals. The word is neoclassical orthopraxy, correct conduct, both ethical and liturgical, as opposed to faith or grace. Orthopraxy is in contrast with orthodoxy, which emphasizes correct belief and ritual in the practice of ritual. Let me look at this. Orthopraxy emphasizes the correct moral or liturgical behavior. Orthodoxy emphasizes correct belief of the Holy Trinity. Muslims are expected to surrender their religious faith for obeying the law of God. Sharia is the fundamental basis of being a Muslim faithful. There is no room for argument concerning the existence of what? Okay, so I guess I don't really understand it still. It's kind of, so it's the emphasis on, I guess it's an emphasis on the outward things, like what we do. It's the emphasis on what correct works. It's an emphasis on our works instead of our faith. Okay. This leads us to state that if the classic but outmoded view of propaganda consists in defining it as an adherence of man to an orthodoxy, so what's an orthodoxy? It's a belief, adherence to a belief. True modern propaganda seeks, on the contrary, to obtain orthopraxy, so behavior. Okay, so he's talking about belief versus action, or I think an action that in itself, and not because of the value judgments of the person who is acting, leads directly to a goal which for the individual is not conscious and intentionally objective to be obtained. Which for the individual is not a conscious and intentional objective to be attained, but which is considered such by the propagandist. That's a really I'm having a hard time understanding this. The propagandist knows what objective should be sought and what action should be accomplished, and he maneuvers the instrument that will secure precisely this action. This is a particular example of a more general problem. The separation of thought and action in our society. We are living in a time when systemically, though without our wanting it is so, action and thought are being separated. In our society, he who thinks can no longer act for himself. He must act through the agency of others, and in many cases he cannot act at all. He who acts cannot first think out his action, either because of lack of time and the burden of his personal problems, or because society's plan demands that he translate others' thoughts into action. And we see the same division within the individual himself, for he can use his mind only outside the area of his job in order to find himself, to use his leisure to better himself, to discover what best suits him, and thus to individualize himself. Whereas in the context of his work, he yields to the common necessity, the common method, the need to incorporate his own work into the overall plan. Escape into dreams is suggested to him while he performs wholly mechanized actions. Propaganda creates the same division. Of course, it does not cancel out personality. It leaves man complete freedom of thought, except in his political or social action, where we find him channeled and engaged in actions that do not necessarily conform to his private beliefs. He even can have political convictions and still be led to act in a manner apparently contradictory to them. Thus, the twists and turns of skillful propaganda do not present insurmountable difficulties. The propagandist can mobilize man for action that is not in accord with his previous convictions. Modern psychologists are well aware that there is not necessarily any continuity between conviction and action, and no intrinsic rationality in opinions or acts. Into these gaps in continuity, propaganda inserts its lever. It does not seek to create wise or reasonable men, but proselytes and militants. What's a proselyte? I'm assuming that someone, like, it's like a blind follower or something. Proselyte. Learning words. Probably not. A person who has converted from one opinion, religion, or party to another. Oh, interesting.
Proselyte.
Proselyte. Proselyte. There is a certain distance and divergence between opinion and action, between morale and behavior. A man may have a favorable opinion of Jews and still exhibit hostile behavior. The morale of the military unit may be very low, and yet it may still fight well. Similarly, we observe that people rarely know in advance what they want, and even less what they want to do. Once they have taken action, they are capable of declaring in good faith that they acted in a way other than the way they actually did act. Man does not obey his clear opinions or what he believes to be his deliberate will. To control opinion, one must be aware that there is an abyss between what a man says and what a man does. His actions often do not correspond to have any clear motive. Dude, that's like when the atheists, they're like, I don't believe in God, and then they marry a Christian woman. It's like, brah. Your fucking beliefs contradicts your fucking actions, you dumbass. You bitch-ass bitch. If you're a fucking atheist, marry an atheist woman. What the fuck are you doing? You know that atheist women are fucking horrible, and no one in their right mind would want to marry a godless whore. So you marry a good Christian woman. You're a fucking Christian. Fuck you. His actions often do not correspond to any clear motive or to what one would have expected from a previous impression he made. Because of this difference between opinion and action, the propagandist who seeks to obtain action by changing opinions cannot be at all certain of success. He must, therefore, find other ways to secure action. All right. This brings us back to the question of organization. For the proselyte incited to action by propaganda cannot be left alone, cannot be entrusted to himself. If the action obtained by propaganda is to be appropriate, it cannot be individual. It must be collective. Propaganda has meaning only when it obtains convergence, coexistence of a multiplicity of individual action reflexes, whose coordination can be achieved only through the intermediary of an organization. Moreover, the action reflex obtained by propaganda is only a beginning, a point of departure. It will develop harmoniously only if there is an organization in which, and thanks to which, the proselyte becomes militant. Without organization, psychological incitement leads to excessive and deviation of action in the very course of its development. Through organization, the proselyte receives an overwhelming impulse that makes him act with the whole of his being. He is actually transformed into a religious man in the psycho-sociological sense of the term. Justice enters into the action he performs because of the organization of which he is a part. Thus, his action is integrated into a group of conforming actions. Not only does such integration seem to be the principal aim of all propaganda today, it is also what makes the effective propaganda endure. We must insist again that organization is an intrinsic part of propaganda. It is illusory to think one can separate them. Since 1928, an agitator in the Soviet Union must be an organizer of the masses. Before that, Lenin said that a newspaper is propaganda, collective agitation, and collective organization. Similarly, Mao Zedong insists on the difference between communist and capitalist armies, reminding us that the former is responsible for mobilizing the masses through propaganda and organization. He always ties these two elements together. Propaganda among the masses goes hand in hand with organization of the masses. And Maurice Maigret recalls that the relationship between the two elements in connection with May 13th demonstrations in Algiers. These examples demonstrate the error made by writers who want to separate propaganda and organization. For action makes propaganda effect irreversible. This recourse to action permits the propagandist to compensate for a particular weakness of propaganda at the psychological level and to engage the individual in action, either because he is included in a small group, which, as a whole, is action-orientated, or because the role of the propagandist, located on the level of human relations, is to give an example of action and to bring others into this action. Thus, the Soviet agitator's first duty is to set shining example of effort, discipline, and sacrifice. He who acts in obedience to propaganda can never go back. He is now obliged to believe in that propaganda because of his past action. He is obliged to receive from it his justification and authority, without which his action will seem to him absurd or unjust, which would be intolerable. He is obliged to continue to advance in the direction indicated by propaganda, for action demands more action. He is what one calls committed, which is certainly what the Communist Party anticipates, for example, and what the Nazis accomplished. The man who has acted in accordance with the existing propaganda has taken his place in society. From then on, he has enemies. Often, he has broken with his milieu or his family. He may be compromised. He is forced to accept the new milieu and the new friends that propaganda makes for him. Often, he has committed an act reprehensible by traditional moral standards and has disturbed a certain order. He needs a justification for this, and he gets more deeply involved by repeating the act in order to prove that it was just. Thus, he is caught up in a movement that develops until it totally occupies the breadth of his conscience. Propaganda now masters him completely, and we must bear in mind that any propaganda that does not lead to this kind of participation is mere child's play. But we may properly ask how propaganda can achieve such a result, a type of reflex action, by short-circuiting the intellectual process. The claim that such results are indeed obtained by propaganda will beget skepticism from the average observer, strenuous denial from the psychologist, and the accusation that this is mere fantasy contradicted by experience. Later, we shall examine the validity of experiments made by psychologists in these fields and their adequacy in regard to the subject. For the moment, we shall continue ourselves to stating that observation of men who were subjected to a real propaganda, Nazi or communist, confirms the accuracy of the schema we have just drawn. Oh, great. New word, schema. What the fuck word? It's a stupid word. Sounds like a Jew word. Schema. A representation of a plan or theory in form of an outline or model. It's a reification. It's a reification fallacy. Okay. We must, however, qualify our statement. We do not say that any man can be made to obey any incitement to action in any way whatever from one day to the next. We do not say that in each individual prior elementary mechanisms exist on which it is easy to play and which will unfailingly produce a certain effect. We do not hold with a mechanistic view of man, but we must divide propaganda into two phases. There is pre-propaganda or sub-propaganda, and there is active propaganda. This follows from what we have said earlier about the continuous and permanent nature of propaganda. Obviously, what must be continuous is not the active, intense propaganda of crisis, but the sub-propaganda that aims at mobilizing individuals, or in the etymological sense, to make them mobile and mobilizable in order to thrust them into action at the appropriate moment. It is obvious that we cannot simply throw a man into action without any preparation, without having mobilized him psychologically and made him responsive, not to mention physically ready. Yeah, so for those Trump supporters that rioted in the Capitol, you want to argue that Trump and his fucking propaganda team didn't fucking... They laid the groundwork of pre-propaganda, being like, "Oh, the election is stolen," or this is a fake election, or you should go to the Capitol and destroy it. They totally set them up with pre-propaganda. People are defending Trump for this. I mean, Trump is like obviously a puppet, but it's like at the same time, motherfucker's responsible for inciting a goddamn riot, and you want to act like he's not. Like, what in the fuck? Like, it's clear as fucking day. The term to mobilize is constantly applied by Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Goebbels, and others to the work that precedes propaganda itself. The essential objective of pre-propaganda is to prepare a man for a particular action, to make him sensitive to some influence, to get him into condition for the time when he will effectively and without delay or hesitation participate in an action. Seen from this angle, pre-propaganda does not have a precise ideological objective. It has nothing to do with an opinion, an idea, a doctrine. It proceeds by psychological manipulations, by character modifications, by the creation of feelings or stereotypes useful when the time comes. It must be continuous, slow, imperceptible. Man must be penetrated in order to shape such tendencies. He must be made to live in a certain psychological climate. The two great routes that this sub-propaganda takes are the conditioned reflex and the myth. Propaganda tries, first of all, to create conditioned reflexes in the individual by training him so that certain words, signs, or symbols have certain persons or facts provoke unfailing reactions. Interesting. So that's why they use the symbols. Despite many protests from psychologists, creating such conditioned reflexes, collectively as well as individually, is definitely possible. But of course, in order for such a procedure to succeed, a certain amount of time must elapse, a period of training and repetition. One cannot hope to obtain automatic reactions after only a few weeks. Repetition of the same formulas. A real psychic reformation must be undertaken so that after months of patient work, a crowd will react automatically in the hoped-for direction to some image. But this preparatory work is not yet propaganda, for it is not yet immediately applicable to a concrete case. What is visible in propaganda, what is spectacular, and seems to us often incomprehensible or unbelievable, is possible only because of such slow and not very explicit preparation. Without it, nothing would be possible. On the other hand, the propagandist tries to create myths by which man will live, which respond to his sense of the sacred. By myth, we mean an all-encompassing active image, a sort of vision of desirable objectives that have lost their material, practical character and have become strongly colored, overwhelming, and all-encompassing, in which displace from the conscious all that is not related to it. Such an image pushes man to action precisely because it includes all that he feels is good, just, and true. Without giving a metaphysical analysis of the myth, we will mention the great myths that have been created by various propagandas. The myth of race. Nice! Nice! True! We're all one fucking race. It's so stupid. Of the proletariat. What's the proletariat? Isn't that like the working class? Let's check this out. Proletariat. Workers are working class people. Ah, I know what a word meant. For once. Okay, give me a second. I'm gonna check something. Where am I? Okay. I forgot where it was. Can't remember. A real psychic reformation must be undertaken so that after months of patient work, a crowd will react automatically in the hoped for direction to some image. But this preparatory work is not yet propaganda, for it is not yet immediately applicable to a concrete case. What is visible in propaganda, what is spectacular, and seems to us often incomprehensible or unbelievable, is possible only because of such slow and not very explicit preparation. Without it, nothing would be possible. On the other hand, the propagandist tries to create myths by which man will live, which respond to his sense of the sacred. Oh, I've already read all that. By myth, we mean an all-encompassing active image, a sort of vision of desirable objectives to have lost their material, practical character, and have become strongly colored, overwhelming, and all-encompassing, in which displace from conscious all that is not related to it. Such an image pushes man to action precisely because it includes all that he feels is good, just, and true. Without giving a metaphysical analysis of the myth, we will mention the great myths. The myth of race, the proletariat, of the Führer, of communist society, of productivity. Like the capitalists have the myth of productivity, the communists have the myth of like this paradise where everyone's equal. Eventually, the myth takes possession of a man's mind so completely that his life is consecrated to it. But that effect can be created only by slow, patient work, by all the methods of propaganda, not by any immediate propaganda operation, or when conditioned reflexes have been created in a man, and he lives in a collective myth, can he be readily mobilized. Although the two methods of myth and conditioned reflex can be used in combination. Each has separate advantages. The United States prefers to utilize the myth. The Soviet Union has for a long time preferred the reflex. The important thing is that when the time is right, the individual can be thrown into action by active propaganda, by the utilization of the psychological levers that have been set up, and by the evocation of the myth. No connection necessarily exists between his action and the reflex or the content of the myth. The action is not necessarily psychologically conditioned by some aspect of the myth, for the most surprising thing is that the preparatory work leads only to a man's readiness. Once he is ready, he can be mobilized effectively in very different directions, but of course the myth and the reflex must be continually rejuvenated and revived, or they will atrophy. That is why pre-propaganda must be constant, whereas active propaganda can be sporadic when the goal is a particular action or involvement. Political education in Lenin and Mao's sense corresponds exactly to our idea of sub-propaganda, or basic propaganda, as Goebbels would say. For this education, it is no way objective or disinterested. Its only goal is to create in the individual a new Weltanschauung inside with each of the propositions of propaganda will become logical. Each of its demands will be indisputable. It is a matter of forming new presuppositions, new stereotype, that are prior justifications for the reasons and objectives which propaganda will give to the individual. But while the prejudices and stereotypes in our society are created in a somewhat incoherent fashion, singly and haphazardly, in political education we have the systemic and deliberate creation of a coherent set of presuppositions that are above challenge. Probably at the beginning of the Soviet Revolution, such political education did not have precise objectives or practical aims. Indoctrination was an end in itself. But since 1930, this concept has changed, and political education has become the formulation of propaganda. Mao has done this even earlier. In the Soviet Union, ideological indoctrination is now the means of achieving an end. It is the foundation on which propaganda convinces the individual of whatever it wants to convince him. To make this clear, we will use the classic terms of propaganda and agitation, taken in a new sense. Propaganda is the elucidation of the Marxist-Leninist doctrine and corresponds to pre-propaganda. Agitation's goal is to make individuals act as a function of their political education, and also in terms of this education, which corresponds to what we call propaganda. Active experience, in effect, makes further education easier. The different elements are easily mixed. The radio network is given the task to increase political knowledge and political awareness, pre-propaganda, and to rally the population to support the policy of the party and the government, propaganda. The film industry is giving orders. Even comedies must organize the thoughts and feelings of the audience in the required proletarian direction. The effects of such political education are often described by Mao. It creates class consciousness. It destroys the individualist and petit bourgeois spirit while assimilating the individual in a collectivity of thought. It creates ideological conformity in a new framework. It leads to understanding the necessity for the sharing of property, obedience to the state, creation of authority and hierarchy. It leads the comrade to vote for suitable representatives and to withstand the wariness of the difficulties of the battle for increased production. This describes perfectly the role of infrastructure assigned to political education in the process of propaganda. All right. That's a good point to stop and take a break. Thank you.